First of all, I want to say thank you to Martin for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm very thankful for having this opportunity to talk about my absolute favorite topic to talk about. So I hope to be able to share with you, and if I start speaking too quickly, wave at me. I'm happy to slow down. My students wave at me and get me to slow down all the time, so I'm used to that. Okay, so I'd like to talk to you about the deportation and the return of the Crimean Tatars to their historic homeland. And how many of you have read about it, studied it?
I've heard something about it.
You've heard something about it? Okay, so as you may or may not know, the Crimean Tatar genocide is actually one of the clearest and yet at the same time paradoxically least studied of all of the genocides that happened in the 20th century. On May 18th, 1944, shortly after the victory over Nazi forces, the Crimean Tatars were deported according to an order by Stalin. And it was really a remarkable act of human engineering, right? It was swift, it was massive, it was deadly, right? In the course of some 3 days, the entire population was removed from the peninsula. And they were put into cattle cars, transported to Central Asia, and once in Central Asia, they died of dehydration, malnutrition, and disease. Now, accounts vary, but we think that somewhere around 46% of the total population died, the total population on the peninsula died as a result of that deportation. So while they were victims of genocide and essentially erased from official history after that, they did not, as the Soviet leaders hoped, disappear or fully assimilate with the groups in Central Asia. Nor did they forget their experience, even when the Soviet regime forbid them from talking about or commemorating Crimea. Rather, they developed this common narrative of what had happened to them that spanned republics and generations. And they also developed a peaceful and democratic movement at great cost and great risk to themselves. So the question that I'd like to ask is, how did they survive and eventually thrive against all odds? And how did they live to actually repatriate to their historic homeland? And my book explores the role that memory and history play in that process. And what I suggest is that this desire to repatriate developed out of a process of recollecting the past that made Crimean Tatars feel linked to each other, and perhaps as importantly, linked to the land. So that combined with counter histories, by which I mean any history that goes against the grain of official Soviet history, that is what convinced the Tatars to risk everything for life in Crimea. And I'm an anthropologist, and so what interests me are the very sort of fine-grained level, you could say the micro-practices through which people, particularly the second and the third generation, became as emotionally invested and politically committed to returning to the historic homeland. And what I mean by micro-practices will become clear because I'll give you some examples throughout about the methodologies that I like to use. Okay, so I went to Crimea for the first time in 1995. I know it's hard to believe that I'm actually that old, but it's true. That is me in the left-hand corner 20 years ago, right? And what happened was I started in Moscow working in the Lenin Library. I also looked at archives at Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow. And through a growing chain of acquaintances, I met some other Crimean Tatars. One of them wanted to open a museum. The other one was starting to remap the toponyms that had been erased from the maps. He was remapping Crimea. So we made an expedition together that summer, sleeping in the forest in tents by night and going to villages by day. Now, my companions preferred exploring and hiking in Crimea and swimming to sitting with villagers. So I was left in peace with my magnetophone for hours on end with villagers. And you can just imagine how much tea and coffee I drank on that expedition, right? Because it was tea, then coffee, and then tea, and then more coffee. I've gone back many, many times. I lived there from 1997 to 1998. I monitored the first independent Ukrainian census with the Watson Institute at Brown University. UNHCR sent me to evaluate the efforts to reduce statelessness. Radio Free Europe Liberty sent me to evaluate the situation with mass media. Most recently, I went with the Organization for Security and Cooperation Europe, and then in 2013 for my own research. So when I lived from 1997 to 1998, I lived primarily with families, sharing their hardships. There were rolling blackouts, no running water, no indoor plumbing. And when when I started this research, I was very interested in ethnic identity. But then in village after village, I became convinced that what concerned Crimean Tatars the most was it wasn't about identity, it wasn't about, language. What concerned them the most was the sense of having a homeland. And I feel like that was very well encapsulated for me in the village of Kokos, where I spoke to a woman about why she had left a quite comfortable lifestyle in Central Asia for what was basically a hut, right? You can imagine what it sounded like when it rained. That's sheet metal, and so when it rains, it's absolutely deafening. Why did she abandon this perfectly manageable life in Central Asia for life in her historic homeland? She said, Vatan, it's bread, it's water, ancestors, air, blood, everything. And she said that and she broke into tears, and suddenly I began to understand how deeply that was felt. So my book looks at how private recollection, as well as public commemoration and reinterpretations of history facilitated this return, and that's really the connecting thread that I want to trace for you today. And as an anthropologist, I feel, that's what my book is. It's private recollection, public commemoration, and counter-history. Together, that's what inspired the repatriation. And as an anthropologist, I'm pretty convinced that this collection of memories and production of lay knowledge about the past are equally important as elite histories, right? Because they sort of create the ground or the framework in which elite political debates take place. And so my study is going to differ from others by considering at a much more specific level how these patriotic sentiments get created in everyday exchanges between people. So I'm just going to take you through the chapters. It's not going to surprise you. First, am I speaking slowly enough? I'm comprehensible? Okay, so it's not going to surprise you that the history of Crimea is very contested. Right? It's not going to surprise you at all.
Different points of view.
Pardon?
From different points of view.
Yes, different points of view. Always. And yes, always contested. So
history is contestable at all. History is contestable in general.
In general,
History.
in general. Right. I think what's interesting though is that if you look at other countries where there has been genocide or a traumatic past, with time, there is some sort of common narrative that is developed, right? So take South Africa. People still disagree about the past, but they've kind of developed a general story that they're willing to share. And that's not true of Crimea. And just there's many, many examples, but of course, a Slavic Russian interpretation would say the Crimean Khanate was a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. Crimean Tatars would bring forward evidence that shows that the Crimean Khanate was actually a full-fledged state, right, in the modern sense of that term. Similarly, the Soviet and even Russians in Crimea today will tell you that the deportation was a humane act because it took the Crimean Tatars to a warm climate where delicious melons grow. Right? Not comprehending at all that this was, led to the death of half of the population. Right? Crimean Tatars, of course, will contest that and say this was a genocide. You have to realize we did not go to resorts, right? We went to the special settlement regime. And so my first chapter looks at this contested history with an appreciation for the fact that I put this on a grayscale, but there's actually very little gray area. It's really interpreted in terms of black and white. And there's many other examples, but I'll just keep going. My second chapter, The Faces of Public Memory, basically considers the German occupation of Crimea that was used as a pretext, right? That was the pretext for the deportation. The Crimean Tatars were accused of collaboration with the German regime. So what I tried to do in that chapter was dive below simplistic accounts, dive below the black and white accounts, to produce a more nuanced picture. And I did that by, and this is the methodological part, juxtaposing the personal testimony of survivors with mass media sources that were produced during the occupation and Soviet historical sources.
Which occupation?
Hmm?
Which occupation?
Germans from 1941 to 1944. Okay, so my methodology was basically a form of triangulation between these three sources. And I read the newspapers in Crimean Tatar with the help of translators. So we literally sat in the archives and read them page by page together. And as you can imagine, this provided a fourth source of information, right? Their reaction to these papers, which of course differed considerably from both the history that they had read in history books and what their parents had told me. So to write this chapter, I tried to bring these sources together. Of course, Soviet accounts are unequivocal. The Crimean Tatars were traitors, and there's just masses and masses of evidence of what that picture leaves out. Things like the Crimean Tatars weren't allowed to join the partisans at first. The German propaganda machine fed information that all the Tatars were on their side as psychological warfare against the Russians. The partisans in the trenches miscommunicated to their higher communist command. So the Soviet interpretation of Tatars' wartime activity was based on not just the activities themselves, right? The Soviets actually expected disloyalty from the Tatars because they were seen as Muslims belonging more to the East and the West, and because they'd had good relations with Germans a couple of decades earlier. And so the Soviet account basically disregards the very real contribution of the Tatars for the Soviet cause, and the politicians and historians built an image that was basically built on rumor and misrepresentation, right? It was a great deal of fabrication. Compared to official sources, when I interviewed informants who were Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar, they had a much more tempered view, and I think that this is a really important thing to acknowledge about the occupation, was just the sheer complexity of the time, right? Sometimes families a person could switch sides, sometimes in a single day, and go to one side and then back again to accomplish some objective, or sometimes people were working on both sides within a nuclear family. And so it's very, talking about patriotism and treason in this sense is very difficult to do given this very complicated period. When I compared informants' recollections of recollections to the German-financed papers, it was interesting because whereas all informants basically remembered a time where their sole purpose was survival, right? And what the German-financed Crimean Tatars papers portrayed was this very politicized freedom that was aimed at exactly what the Soviets had failed to provide. Like rights to language, rights to religion, rights to nationality. So the Crimean Tatars soon came to realize that they were wrong about the Germans too, and they worked to reconfigure this version as a pathway to securing their rightful place on the peninsula. But what I suggest in this chapter is that one of the obstacles here is the very terms of the debate of treason and patriotism, which pretty much just tell us what the victors think. So I think that if patriotism and treason were secondary to survival at the time, they've definitely become important political currency today, and have driven a wedge between the Slavic and the Crimean Tatar population, because this debate is now any debate that's about resources to land, right, draws on these old historical grievances. But I try to question the terms of the debate so that we can start asking different kinds of questions, because I think the more important question is not, who's wrong or who's right, but what kind of categorical thinking would lead anyone to believe you could put an entire group of people in a single category, right? It's like this categorical thinking that we really have to question more than the way that the debate is framed today. The third chapter is called Exile, and it provided the first published Crimean Tatar descriptions of the 1944 deportation. And so to carry this out, I carried out a lot of interviews with Uzbekistan. My oldest informant was 100 years old. She was lying down. And my youngest informant was 11 years old. And the testimony that they provided filled a very significant gap. I really like this quote from Murat Aji, who says that our history was defiled and stolen. They wanted us to always live as slaves and Ivans, never remembering our heritage. And I think that the extent to which the Soviet authorities monopolized official history and attempted to control memory has been demonstrated abundantly, right? We all know that was part of the way that the Soviet Union operated. It was to monopolize the production of official history. And so if you look at Soviet publications for information about the deportation, there was near silence. There was a decree in Izvestia in 1946, but after that the topic was basically ignored, and simultaneously they stopped counting Crimean Tatars in the census. They eliminated or shortened descriptions in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, and it was really only in the 1990s when a couple of historians, Zemskov and Bugaj, started to try to bring some facts about the deportation to light, in terms of the numbers that had been deported, the numbers that had perished. But at that moment, what was still lacking was a Crimean Tatar point of view, a first-person view of what had gone on in that time period. And that was what I sought to capture by means of recording interviews, transcribing them, translating them, analyzing them. And of course, these narratives provide a very compelling counterpoint to what the NKVD statistics said, right? It's a counter-narrative. They contradicted it. But I think what is most significant about these stories was that in spite of the fact that the story lacked any written support for over 50 years, in spite of the fact that it was actively suppressed, people were actively discouraged from speaking about it, there still developed a common narrative that had basically the same elements across generations, across republics, and I think that is what is significant. These are the basic elements. And I think that employing this sort of as what you could call a genre, Crimean Tatars, they preserved very valuable knowledge of the past that would otherwise have been lost. But I think that also these narratives are a way of connecting the individual to the social, right? They tell about symbolic truths, right, more than literal truths. So they tell about social truths in a very symbolic way. So for example, naked and barefoot, right? You could say that they weren't literally naked, they were wearing pajamas, but the deeper point is that that act of deportation stripped them of their humanity, right? And so the deportation stories that are told use metaphor and allegory. It's almost like a form of poetry because the same phrases can be repeated by anybody from age 11 to 100. I think that these stories are also important because, of course, recollecting can also be a form of mourning, right, the past. And it's interesting that I think that these stories also provided a source of inspiration, right, incredible inspiration for the national movement that was to develop once they were in Central Asia. So I became very interested in how it was that this common narrative had developed, and what I found answers when I started analyzing not just what the story was, what the poetics of it was, but also how it was told and when it was told, right? The mechanics, the technology of transmission. And so I started to study that, and I came to appreciate the significance of both emotion and the trauma in how these stories got passed on. There's a Spanish language concept called memoria de sangre, blood memories, and it's this notion that sometimes there's an event in history that becomes so pivotal that it becomes a standard against which everything else is measured. But the catch is that, so the anthropologists that write about memoria de sangre in Argentina there, the trauma led to silence, right? But there again, here, the Crimean Tatars developed this very powerful narrative about what had happened. They weren't silenced by the trauma. So typical anthropological, sociological accounts will tell you that stories are passed down from one generation to the next, right? And what my research showed was a much less straightforward process, one in which the second generation actually had a very active role to play. So just one example of that, one day I was sitting at a kitchen table, I taped a story, I spoke to the grandmother in the family, and as I was turning off my tape recorder, her son got up off the couch in the living room, walked into the kitchen and said, "No, you have it all wrong. You forgot to tell her." And then he went through the elements, right, that she had overlooked in her narrative. And so part of what I try to explore is how the story that is told has really been woven collectively, right? It's not a straightforward process of transmission. It's very much a collective product. And to more deeply analyze this, I actually interviewed the other groups that were also deported from Crimea, right? Crimean Tatars weren't the only ones. It was also Armenians, Bulgarians, Germans, and Greeks. And through this process of interviewing, I identified three basic styles of recollecting within the families: intensive, selective, and reluctant. The intensive is sort of recalling the beauty of Crimea, very much very sensual and embodied, right? So if you're serving jam with tea, you would talk about the kazul jam that you ate in Crimea as a way of infusing your children with this love of Crimea. The selective style had to do with some of the intensive recalling, but more importantly, telling about deportation very strategically when the parents felt that children were ready to understand, right? And this was typically something that was done not necessarily from earliest childhood, but in a way that protected the children in case they said something inadvertently, and it was interpreted at least as anti-Soviet. So telling children about deportation very selectively. And these styles of intensive and selective recollection can be contrasted with a third style, which I call reluctant, which is sort of encapsulated in the idea that an Armenian person said, basically, it's too late to cry, right? That time, that moment has passed. It's too late to cry. Or they would say, I'm so glad we don't talk about that in our family. I think it's important to point out, like, no family is an island, right? It was sometimes a friend or an uncle that would prompt people to elicit stories from their parents about what had really gone on. And what's interesting here, I think, is that if the intensive style is oriented towards activism, the reluctant style steers clear of it. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's only the Crimean Tatars that the intensive and the selective style predominated among Crimean Tatars, and they also developed a national movement, right? Because that national movement resonated so deeply with the stories that had been passed on. I think that the circulation of stories and images within families is especially clear in the families of artists. So I interviewed a lot of artists about their work, and how many people have seen the painting on the top before? Great. Right? So it's become kind of iconic of deportation. It was on a billboard in 2013, letting people know about the commemoration. And I think that this kind of demonstrates what I'm talking about, the importance of recollection, because Rustam Aminov, who is of course the author of these paintings, makes it very clear that I didn't see this, right? I'm painting this from the stories that my mother told me. Right? And so I visited him in his studio in Uzbekistan and saw these paintings. So I think that these recollections of deportation create this rich background that inform the struggle to return to the historic homeland. And if we probe this technology, we can better understand the important role that recollecting plays. My fifth chapter on the national movement considers how the practices of recalling with reinterpretations of history energize the national movement. Basically, activists harnessed this energy into a national movement. And to jumpstart the movement, they started with studying their history, right? And realizing that they had had a full-fledged state before. And to write this chapter, I worked with Soviet historical sources, as well as very intensively taking full life histories with national activists in the national movement. And as just one example, I think you can, so this is of course Mustafa Jaliliev and his wife years and years ago. And then here is Ayşe Sitmuratova, who I worked very closely with. And she basically said that she became active when she said, the stories I heard in my family and the history I heard in school are completely different, right? Something is completely wrong with this. And this spurred her to activism. And what I argue in this chapter is that over time, I looked at they recalled they recollected trying to work with Soviet authorities to allow them to return. And looking at these over time, what I started to see was a transformation in the way that they saw the state, right? And in the beginning of the movement, they saw the Soviet state as monolithic, right? And so they started by gathering petitions and sending letters to the Soviet authorities, appealing to them. When that strategy wasn't successful, they shifted their strategy. And so eventually they came to see that the Soviet regime could easily be challenged based on its own internal contradictions. So one of the tactics that Ayşe Sitmuratova used, an activist like her, was to basically invert the meaning of what it meant to be pro or anti-Soviet. And they found ample evidence and support for their rehabilitation, basically in Soviet nationalities policy, right? So if you take note from Soviet nationalities policy, it becomes very obvious that they had every right to return to their historic homeland. And so gradually through their interpretations of policy, the activists in the movement created an atmosphere in which return seemed obvious, it seemed self-evident. And it's an important part of my argument here because the recollecting that the movement actually encouraged, it became sort of a reciprocal process, right? The recollecting in families inspired the movement, but once the movement had gained momentum, it encouraged further recollection, right? And so that those styles obviously changed dramatically with glasnost and perestroika. For the sixth chapter, I looked very specifically at one event within the movement, which was the self-immolation of Musa Mamu. who became a martyr and a model, basically through remembrance. And I was drawn to this topic because no matter where I went in Central Asia, no matter where I went in Crimea, people would tell me his story as a way of communicating something that was very central to them. And if you don't, do I still have some time? I'm okay for time? Okay. So there was a decree in 1967 that said that the Crimean Tatars had been wrongfully deported. That was taken as great encouragement, and Musa Mahmud was one of the people who returned in the 60s hoping to resettle his family on the peninsula. But what he encountered, of course, was tremendous opposition from the authorities in the form of, he couldn't get a propiska, he couldn't get a job. They worked informally in this rose plantation. And so what I did was I went and I talked to his family and I talked to his son, and as well as activists that had recorded testimony of the event at the time. And what his son told me was that his father had served a 2-year prison sentence and come home. And one day they were in their house and he saw the policeman drive up on his motorcycle, and he told his son to wait inside, not to open the curtains. And of course, he's a boy, he's a young boy, what is he going to do? He's going to open the curtains. And what he saw when he opened the curtains was that his father looked wet, somehow. And then he saw his father fail to ignite. The second match lit. He went up in flames. He ran towards the policeman. His friends, Redvan and another gentleman, tripped him. They had put the flames out, took him to a hospital. And he died 6 days later, never expressing regret for what he had done. And what I explore in this chapter is the way that his memory translated very sort of diffuse and amorphous feelings and values into a model, right? He was a martyr, but he was also a model. And so what tended to happen in conversations about activism was people would, I used linguistic theories here, but basically they would align themselves with what he had done. And this is actually one area in which memory wasn't very accurate, because they took very accurate testimony at the time, 1978, when he immolated himself. And later, everybody attributed phrases to him that he doesn't appear to ever have said, but here again, it was a meaning that came together collectively, right? What it came to them mean was for the people. So Redvan, who was the person who wrapped him in a blanket, eventually, even though he had veteran status and wasn't in danger of being deported, he ended up using that tactic as a way to defend themselves against incursions by the authorities when they were trying to make land claims in Crimea. You also see mention, there's poetry that's written about Musa Mahmud, there's testimony, and it's also, I think it was interviewing Mustafa Jamiliev, he told me that Musa Mahmud was very inspirational to him, right? Because he had made a choice to either live and die, to live and to die in the homeland, rather than be deported another time, right? And by making that choice, that choice became an inspiration. And the way that that was recalled basically made these diffuse values, it made them very concrete and very, very clear. In my 7th chapter, I talk about how they repatriated. And the Crimean Tatars found that after the fall of the Soviet Union, self-immolation still made sense. And at this point, it was not a act of political protest as much as a pragmatic strategy. So what happened was they, of course, were unable to simply purchase property. And they were unwilling to take it away from the people who had lived there for 50 years. And so what they ended up doing was squatting on vacant land. Some of it was urban, some of it was rural. I myself participated in this particular capture in Crimea. They basically took over abandoned property and made it into homes, and then worked with the authorities to establish that presence legally. But to highlight what is distinctive about this approach, I think it's interesting to look back and compare Tsarist and Soviet times, because the post-Soviet repatriation, with their attitude towards the peninsula after Empress Catherine II annexed the territory for the first time in 1783, and the current time couldn't be more different, right? At that point, when Crimea was annexed, it led to a massive exodus of Crimean Tatars. The accounts vary, but over a couple of decades, some accounts suggest maybe 3/4 of the population left the peninsula at that time. And it's an interesting contrast, because the land that they were ready to die for in the late 1990s was the land that they were willing to die for in the 1990s. So it was against this backdrop that I studied the process of returning. And I think that memory and recollection were crucial in this process in a couple of ways. The first way was that many people tried to get as close as they possibly could to the places where their parents or ancestors had lived. And another way that memory and recollection played a very important role was that the houses that they left behind provided very important memory aids and a way to talk about homeland that reinforced their efforts. And here again, we get to, the psychological literature calls it involuntary memory, but basically it's embodied memory. So homes were central because, in part through the lack of written records, right? That albums were lost or destroyed. Memories and diaries were too dangerous to compose. But when they visited the homes where their families had lived, it would trigger floods of memory, right? They would touch the floor and they would remember how a piece of wood had fallen out of the fire onto that spot, and it would bring back to presence a whole set of experiences that they had forgotten about. So homes were memory aids. And this brings us back to the physicality of it. So only some were lucky enough to visit and reclaim their ancestral homes. The vast majority had to capture empty land. And so Simferopol, of course, is surrounded by fields with self-built houses. It started as being called Samozahvat, then it evolved to being Polyanya Protest. And this strategy was sometimes backed up by threats of self-immolation. So a woman told me a story of how when authorities tried to evict her, basically she told them, she pointed to the gallons of water and basically said, there's gasoline and I'm going to blow us all up if you don't back off, right? And so it became a strategy for securing those land claims. This particular one is on the south coast. This is the interior of that building, and both of these are taken at Sinis, right? There was a dispute that was in 2006, so it was a process that was pretty protracted. And I think that in my last chapter, one of the things I talk about is how Crimean Tatars came to a moment where they said quite emphatically that we're not a national minority, we are the indigenous people, right? And so that was in the late 90s. And I think that that remains a question, right? Will the rights of the indigenous people be recognized? Will they be affirmed? And that's a big question, and it's outstanding. So I'm going to stop there and take any, does anybody have any questions, comments, criticisms?
Thank you for the presentation, and I have one question. Could you come back to your picture where you compared narratives, like Slavic narratives and Crimean Tatars, because I don't understand what do you mean is Slavic.
Okay, so what I found was that recollecting within families was very important, but not all families did this in the same way. Some families were very intense about telling children about where they...
Oh no, I'm sorry, I think it's not about family practices, but it's the previous.
Previous.
Some of the previous ones. Yeah.
This one?
No,
about the Slavic Slavic interpretation of history.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
This one?
Yeah, the way of this historic land, yes. And here you have Slavic interpretation and Crimean Tatar interpretation. So what do you mean Slavic interpretation? I mean, I'm puzzled.
Oh, okay, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. What I mean by that is what a typical Slavic person in Crimea would tell you if you asked them today, right? So this is very much a politicized history, right?
So do you include like Russians, Ukrainians, Russians, like classical, or less classical understanding of Slavics, or whom do you mean?
Russians and Ukrainians in Crimea.
Це дійсно властиво
It should be
населенню.
rather a Soviet interpretation.
Yeah.
Soviet is communist interpretation.
And I don't mean to attribute that to all non-Crimean Tatars, right? It's an interpretation that's very prevalent in Crimea for the very specific reason that it legitimates the Slavic presence in Crimea, the Russians and Ukrainians, and primarily the Russians, right? So if you ask, you know, a Russian in the...
And there is no difference between Ukrainians and Russians?
Of course there's differences, of course.
In their interpretations?
In Crimea,
I mean, you include
it's marginal.
It's, well, I wanted to avoid pointing the finger at the Russians because in Crimea it seems like there's a lot of mixed marriages, and I don't, I think that in Crimea people get along on an everyday level, but if you ask a person of Slavic heritage in the government of Crimea about history, that is what they will tell you. They will see, and it's a politicized history in the sense that it's not based on nuances or facts as much as something that they can pull from to justify their political position. So in no way do I need to disparage Russians or Ukrainians, right? But this is an interpretation that circulates, that's used as a way of further marginalizing the Crimean Tatars. So on the part, if somebody wants to marginalize the Crimean Tatars, this is how they do it, right? That's part of how they do it. They say they were, they would tell you that the Crimean Khanate was a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, that they welcomed the rule of Empress Catherine, that they welcomed it basically from Catherine to Khrushchev, right? And then they would tell you that the deportation was humane, and that it benefited the Tatars, right?
Did you interview them?
Pardon?
Did you interview them?
Who?
I mean,
Russians?
yeah.
Extensively. Extensively.
But thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, and what struck me was that you actually you've underscored the difference of the collective memory of the Armenians, Greeks, Germans, and Bulgarians on one hand, probably, and the collective memory of the Crimean Tatars on the other hand. 2 days ago, there was a press conference held in Simferopol where a leader, or one of the leaders of the German national minority in Crimea, stood up saying that, hey, you, the Crimean Tatar TV channel, you are no way different from all the others, so you better, keep up to the legislation. So, basically, he had a very explicit pro-Russian stance, to which a Crimean Tatar journalist, a prominent one, Lydia Bujurova, stood saying that what you are saying now, we've been through this in our history, when one of us kept silent when his neighbor was, repressed, and then the next day they would come after you.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about why the rest of the peoples who were deported from Crimea from 1941 to 44, why didn't they, elaborate their collective memory, which would make them now oppose the occupation? Because we see probably the Crimean Tatars as the only or one of very few, groups that are outspoken about their stance on the occupation, that they are not accepting it.
Mm-hmm.
What about the Greeks, the Germans, and all the rest? What's wrong with these guys?
Thank you for asking that question. I forgot to mention that what really struck me, I interviewed them in both Central Asia, where they had been exiled to, and I went to Kazakhstan to talk to Germans, and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and I was everywhere. What struck me was that after they were deported, they began to dream not only of returning to Crimea, but also, what about Germany? What about Greece? What about Armenia? What about, You know, they had all sorts of dreams and hopes. And I think that because Crimea is the one and only land for Crimean Tatars, they were exclusively focused on that land. So I think that the fact that it's their only homeland is very significant, and the Germans, you know, many of the Germans actually went to Germany. There was programs, so they were much less focused. And then also I think that the second factor has to do with how the national movement drew on the recollections, but it also encouraged more recollection, right? And so the fact that the Crimean Tatar national movement was another very powerful piece there, right? The other groups didn't have the numbers or the capacity to develop peaceful political movements for their repatriation. So they lacked political organization. Other questions?
Maybe some questions in Russian could be possible. It's more comfortable for someone. So thank you.
You're welcome.